One topic that has come up quite often in the Otago Energy Research Centre discussions has been around smart meter data and access to that. So right at this moment, we are undertaking a project to try and do two things. One is to kind of capture what I guess the experts in the energy sector consider to be the value of smart meter data for a whole variety of reasons. And the second is to explore the kind of the issues with access to smart meter data and how we might be able to overcome some of those things. So we thought a good way to kind of kickstart this project is really to as part of this symposium, to have a panel discussion on this topic. So I'd like to invite our panel members up to the stage now. So Dr. Marcus Pelenur, who was talking this morning, Chief Executive of EECA, Mr. Gareth Cartwright, who you also heard just now, Executive Officer of the Community Energy Network, Dr. Ben Anderson, Principal Research Scientist from BRANZ, who's done a lot of work in smart meter data, both here in New Zealand and in the UK. Dr. Daniel Gnoth, who's the Energy Futures Manager at Powerco. So we've got this kind of variety of perspectives on this topic. Hopefully this will be an interesting discussion. Maybe they'll all agree, maybe they won't. So I've prepared some sort of questions to get us started, and then I'll I guess open it up to the floor for you to ask your own questions. So I guess just to get us started, so putting aside the access issues, which is kind of a big thing, what's the potential value of this data to your organization? Question I'd like to ask. So
for the whole panel?
Yeah, so maybe one by one, because it's your organization, your own organization.
Okay, I love this topic. I'm very happy to be, and apologies in advance. I'm not being deliberately rude. I just have to jet right after the panel to go catch my plane. So if I depart abruptly, that's why. So 2005 to 2009, I was looking after the project engineering division for Zellweger, which was Enermet, which then became Landis & Gyr, which was manufacturing analog and then smart meters, as well as the ripple control systems here for New Zealand. So it was very interesting to be at the kind of involved in the early days and looking after some of the smart meter rollouts in Auckland. To answer your question, I think when you look at the value of power quality and power factor in the low voltage network that smart meters can provide, that is a huge value proposition, as well as much more kind of minute by minute information for energy. So if I think about how is it relevant for EECA, we like to think of ourselves as the energy end use authority or energy demand authority for the government. And so any more data that helps us understand how energy is being used accurately is helpful. And all of the data that sits within a smart meter, particularly around the low voltage network, is very useful for us.
Feeling super underqualified in this panel. I think I'm the only non-doctor. So from our point of view, a really practical one. So roughly 2 years ago, we did a little project to get temperature and humidity sensors, and I know, Kim, you've done that with the Rolkawa crew as well. And the main goal there was to try and work out where our interventions, whether they were government funded or not, including education, were they useful? Were they achieving a result in the home? That information that we got out of that had some problems with the platform for sure, but the causation was a little bit harder to hit because we didn't have the energy data to go alongside the temperature and humidity data that we were getting. And understanding, Janet, from your presentation, that maybe the meters that we've got may not have given us the granular detail that we needed in terms of which devices in the home were causing the highest energy bills and what have you. But I think if we'd been able to include that energy use data in a half-hourly rate, then we would have been able to assess the behaviour in that home that goes alongside the temperature and humidity outcomes. Would have been very useful.
Thanks, Gareth. Has anybody not heard of BRANZ? Don't be shy. Apparently 50% of the population haven't. So BRANZ is a building research agency in New Zealand. We do research, assurance services and so on for the building sector to improve building outcomes for Aotearoa, New Zealand, on a system-wide basis. Historically, predominantly residential, interested in residential homes, but increasingly, I think there's an evolution towards buildings in general. So I've been with BRANZ for 9 months, so I can't exactly give you a BRANZ worldview necessarily, but why would we potentially be interested in smart meter data? Because it gives you a partial and a net energy use view, and those two words are actually quite important. Partial because Hannah actually illustrated really, really nicely that not all of the energy use we're interested in is captured by smart meter data, whether it's electricity or gas. There are all sorts of other fuel uses which are important for what might change in an intervention that you would not necessarily know much about if all you had was smart meter data. And it's net. Net comes from the electricity, obviously, and the increasing solar batteries, etc. So what the grid sees is not what actually is necessarily going on within the home in totality. And if you're interested in how the building is performing and how people are interacting with the technologies such that that's what the performance looks like, then you care about the totality and not just what the grid sees or what the gas meter sees. It's more obviously a problem for electricity. Nevertheless, setting that aside, smart meter data gives us a really useful and interesting set of data for looking at building performance, energy use within buildings, energy use interacting with people's appliance use, so that what's the patterns over time of energy use, how can the reconfiguration of different kinds of infrastructure, if you like, heating, hot water, cooking, all of those things in the home, what could those changes, what could the consequences of those be for the times at which energy is used? You can't do that with monthly billing data. You can't do it with annual totals. You can only do it with fine-grained half-hourly data, for example. We can use that to assess the differences between modeled energy for a building and what we actually see in practice, which of course is an interaction of the building and the people doing stuff. The people doing stuff is my particular interest. So smart meter data for me is a fingerprint on habits. And that's why I'm particularly interested in using that data to understand how people's habits lead to emergent energy demand, which is then what the grid sees.
Thanks, Ben. I work for Powerco, which is a distributor in the North Island. So we are that middleman that's been talked about a little bit today. It was awesome hearing Janet's talk at the start of this because it kind of paints a picture around the maturity of the distribution sector and understanding the role that smart meters are going to have in the future. And what I've seen while I've been part of the sector for the last kind of 10 years is a growing realization that, oh, this isn't just for the market. This is becoming core to the way in which the energy system is going to be run in the future. So that idea of smart network that Janet mentioned has been, thrown around in many different ways. There's a very technocentric kind of way that the energy system will be run in the future. And we're still thrashing that out in many different ways around, like using Flex Forum, for example, as one of the key things to work out what will the energy market of the future look like. But where we're at now, Powerco just got access to smart meter data this year. So it took quite some time for the industry to catch up, to create the mechanism so that the data could be available to other parts in the sector. Now, it's not to say that distributors could get access through other means. Some distributors in the last few years actually installed their own meters right next to the retailer smart meter so that they could start to advance their own networks. So we've been in a bit of a pickle for a while, but some of our rules have got to a point where at least all distributors now can get access to smart meter data from the MEP directly once they have a contract with the retailer. So we are kind of at that starting point in a way, just like a decade ago when the retail sector was saying, what's the value in smart meter data? What can we do with it? The distribution sector is like, wow, we've got it now. What's the value? The key value now is we can see the network. That might seem a bit strange to you, but distributors generally have no visibility of the low voltage network. They've only, over the last few years, been investing in transformer monitors to at least see at a slightly aggregated level what's going on at the customer level. But that's still usually maybe 50, 100 households clumped together. So we're just starting to be able to play around with new tools to actually see what the individual consumption of customers is doing to all the different parts of the network. And but that's really, really exciting, but also kind of frustrating because we know we've got to do a lot of cleanup work with our own records so that we can then say, yes, that this challenge is happening in this space and it is impacting this part of the network, not something else because we drew it wrong 50 years ago. So at the moment, it's really hugely beneficial because we have the potential to have accurate records of what the network actually looks like. The next really important thing is we can start to identify safety issues at the low voltage network that we could never see before. So a thing called broken neutrals, which can cause quite serious incidents in some cases. It's something that through some of the intelligent software that is using smart meter data, this can now automatically identify these things and we can go and fix them before anything goes wrong. Whereas in the past, couldn't see it. So now we're able to see the network, able to see real safety concerns, and then in the next piece is really able to identify where there are real constraints on the network that we can start to plan around and signal to the market, so that's the flex forum kind of thing, to identify opportunities to reduce the potential impact to those very specific parts of the network. And that then gives engineers that kind of assurance that they can withhold spending money on infrastructure for a certain amount of time. And that creates huge amounts of opportunity for NZ Inc. So yeah, massive opportunity. Really excited that we're finally here, but yeah, we're just starting.
Great, thanks for that. Yeah, my next question, I might just skip it, but it was sort of more about, because you've partially answered some of that, which is, what value does it have for New Zealand as a whole? So I think I'll skip that one. But maybe someone wants to ask that in more detail later on. So I think I'll just go straight to, what are the current barriers to accessing this data? And I guess, are these barriers valid? There's been a lot of discussion about privacy, but is that being overly paranoid? And also, who do you think should control access to this data? And I guess if these barriers are valid, what are your concerns about wider access to smart meter data?
Okay. I have the microphone. So I've mentioned barriers a little bit. I think Janet also pointed it out quite nicely that it's smart meter data for a distributor is generally considered third-party data because the distributor doesn't own the meter, doesn't own the relationship with the customer. So the first barrier has been having to come up with some kind of contractual arrangement with the metering provider and with the retailer. And because distribution is a regulated kind of entity, they have to do that with the regulator and change the rules so that they can sort this out. And that's taken a number of years to address those kind of regulations, but we've done that now. So it's not a barrier to get that information, but it is still complicated because there is still a lot of onus on the distributor to create unilateral contracts sometimes, or multiple bilateral contracts with each party. So they have to get an agreement with each individual retailer and then with the MEP about the use of that information. So it just slows everything down quite a lot, rather than kind of just saying, well, here's the standard contract, everyone just signs to that, get on with it. So some of that stuff has really slowed things down as well. And now where things are interesting is all of that work has been done for what we call consumption data. So that's the half-hourly kilowatt-hour stuff that Janet was talking about. However, the smart network stuff that Marcus is talking about is generally much more granular. 1 minute instantaneous voltage and current readings on a smart meter. That's not part of anything that was agreed upon in legislation. Instead, that's another whole new thing that is offered by metering equipment providers as a separate thing, and they have a separate type of agreement. So the first challenge we got was we had two different types of agreements that required us to put everything back. Well, first we couldn't put those two types of data together based on the ways the agreements were set up. We managed to resolve that in the last year, so we can do that. However, they are still two separate agreements. That means that the risk we take by utilizing this information is quite high as being a third-party purchaser of the data. So it means the big challenge we've got is we have to be very conservative about when and how we use it and what systems we bring it into, because we've got to be able to basically audit every single usage of that information. So it becomes quite a slow process to build up that internal capability and trust in our own procedures that we can use that information as we have been required to through the contracts we've signed. That's a start anyway.
I think from a research point of view, we're not in that sort of contractual situation, and we don't have the level, I suppose, the scope of interest on all the megabucks to be looking to deal with some of the MEPs. And I think one of the strengths actually that perhaps was missing off Janet's slide was the license to print money. This is handed to a number of organizations. I didn't say that. So we take the EA route. So we have, for every household, we have to get consent from the householder. We then put that through the process, and a batch process retailer by retailer. And as I know, some in the audience have dealt with this process as well. And we are all dealing with this process in individual projects. So we are all reinventing the wheel in terms of processes. We're reinventing the wheel in terms of trying to get the data that comes back into a sort of clean, usable, analytical format. When that data has gone through this whole series of organizations, starting from the meter, which is owned by whoever, the data is owned by the consumer and the customer, through the MEP, down to the retailer, and back down to us researchers who are trying to make sense of it all. So it seems to me that there has to be a simpler solution which has a lower transaction cost for researchers, never mind for other sort of larger organizations. In terms of control, who should control it? Well, I think we have to remember privacy. We have to bear that in mind as a key issue, because as soon as smart meter data is attached to a record that can identify a house, or even in the case of a single person house, an individual, it becomes personal information, and therefore there's legal requirements around that and ethical ones. You can do things legally which are not necessarily ethical, and researchers have to consider that option, consider that as well. And I think key to maintaining control with the customer is that plays into the data sovereignty space of knowing what's going to happen to your data. And I think that from a research perspective, I think that's quite crucial. And I think that may well be quite crucial across other kinds of organizations trying to work in this space as well. So in a way, I'm sort of echoing what Daniel was saying, but can I just sort of step back a bit to the word open that was in the title of the panel? Because I think whilst household level data perhaps could never be open in the sort of open licensing sense, certainly in the UK at the moment, aggregated data is presumed open. So that's data which is aggregated over more than 3 or 5 smart meters, depending on the rules in play at the time, and is now being released, and potentially, I think, maybe being released as a condition of license, but I'm not absolutely sure on that. The point being, you've got area level aggregated data which can be linked to other area level data and gives you some really interesting insights from a network management perspective, because it can go down to technically, I suppose, feeders on substations, so quite local geographies, and you can do some of the sorts of analyses that I was asking Hannah about, for example, looking at different kinds of demand structures and demand levels at small area level. So if you want to do planning, or if you're a geographer and you want to link it to other kinds of social information as well, you can do so. And that can be open. And the question for me is, how could you do that with the structure, the data structures that currently exist in New Zealand, and who would have to be pushed, let's say, to do that, to make that available at that level?
Pretty much just what been said. Flippantly said, but I guess from a community energy network point of view, we tend to work with the researchers and just kind of trust them that they know what they're doing and how they do it. The one point I'd make that I think is specific to our space is from what we've seen and how we work with our communities, this transition is going to go at the pace of trust. And there's been some reports in the last year or two, like that energy hardship expert panel report I referred to, but also Dr. C. Rotman wrote one that was funded by Mercury and Genesis, and the title was Hidden Hardship. And it's hidden from them, not hidden from the communities that are working with those consumers. And there's a whole range of reasons why those consumers don't want to engage with the retailers or with government or the networks. And I won't go into all of that now, but I think the core element in there is, there's historical issues in there, there's structural issues, even just the market is really inaccessible for people. So really hard for them to engage. So if we're looking at individual residential data, and if we're asking these people to give permission to use that data, they need to know that they can trust the people that are accessing it. I think that's our party line. I've had some really interesting discussions with some of my members recently where they're pushing back on that, and they're saying, if you can, some of the people they're working with are going, man, if you can just help us out, have what you want, just get it done. We want a really good outcome here. And if you can guarantee that outcome, I don't really care. I think that's a youth thing, because they're used to AI, they're used to this online system where their data is being mined all the time anyway, and they've become quite flippant. That's not my generation for sure. So for me, that privacy barrier is still pretty high. I don't think I'd be that ambivalent to that, but there's an interesting dynamic out there that probably needs to be looked at more in terms of, is that data really that valuable or private for some people who are desperate for help?
Great comments. I've got some thoughts, slightly provocative, but just because, we're in a panel and we should do that. I think it's madness, that we're installing meters next to meters. I don't blame any of the EDBs for doing it, because they've had to work within the settings of the system. But that, if anything, is an example of the market settings not working, is duplicating hardware in people's houses. And I'm really encouraged, though it is like 10 years too late, that we are finally starting to allow EDB access to meter data. You look at, though, some of the EDBs that have kept control of their meters and what they have done, like Counties Energy, it is pretty awesome to see what they are doing with that data. So there are examples of if when you get the data access right, some really positive outcomes for New Zealanders. I want to reinforce some of the points that have been made here. I just think the whole paradigm needs to be completely thought about differently. It should start with the person, and it should start with their sovereignty over their data. And everybody in the energy sector should be writing beautiful thank you cards to the individuals every year for access to their data. My question to the MEPs, the meter providers, and to the sector: what value and benefits and thank yous are the householders being given for the use of their data? And has the use of their data really been properly acquired through informed consent? And hearing Janet's presentation that the smart meter hardware has been paid for already, in 5 years. Yeah. Why is it so expensive and hard for EDBs to get access to this data when there's so much value in it? Why are they being charged a lot? Who is profiting from that? It's not the households who actually control the data. So I think the whole system needs to be flipped around to start from a paradigm of this is everyone's individual data, and it should be working for them, and they should be benefited for that. And so to the question around who should control the data, that answers that from my perspective. But I also think I've had some wild conversations with EDBs. And some of them have been telling me that, it's actually like, just leave it to us. We are going to take care of this for the long-term benefit of New Zealand infrastructure and energy users. And we don't need to worry about benefit. Like, we need full central control. And this will allow us to optimize our investments over time, which will put downward pressure on prices. And like, it's a great argument, and I believe in it. However, by cutting out the end user, I don't think that is going to work. And so my kind of the two-way contract that I would like to see with distribution companies and retailers is, if they are going to get access to the data, they need to commit publicly to providing benefits back to those households for the use of that data. And the reason I feel strongly about it is I think it's section 54QZ in the Commerce Act, which has a very strong imperative for EDBs to invest money in energy efficiency and the deferment of capital costs. And with all respect to my EDB colleague on the panel, they have not done that. I'm sorry, not at the levels that they should, nor at the levels that they're being asked to. And the conversations that I've had with them is that it's, we will build the lines because it's what we know how to do, and that is for the long-term benefit of consumers. I'm worried that without any kind of commitment, that lines companies will just take the data to continue to do what they know how to do, which is build more lines. And I think it actually needs to be started with, we're going to take this data to commit to deferring the build out of lines and then passing those benefits on to the local community and to the local users. So on one hand, I'm really pro better visibility of the distribution companies because I think the benefits accrue to them in their planning. So I'm behind that, and they should have easy, unfettered, free access to the data. But the benefits that come from that should go right back to the households who produce the data.
Can I just add something? I totally agree with that. But some of those features of overseas, like in the UK, they have those local area action plan, energy plans, where the ownership of that plan is by the community, and the sector responds to what the community wants to do. And that is completely flipping the current model here. It's quite a paternalistic, just trust us, we know what we're doing. And so I think that dynamic, and in general, I'm not loading up the EDBs here. This is across the sector. It's a very tech push, complex sector. And so whatever we can do to simplify that so that communities understand what's going on and can engage, and to perhaps, I think this is happening in Canterbury now. There is Selwyn, I think, is doing a local energy plan right now. We should probably take a pretty close look at that and understand how data could be used in there, and so the community takes some ownership of what's going on.
Dan, did you want to respond to that, or should I?
I kind of agree with everything. So, but I think around the way in which, EDBs are thinking about data at the moment, I would put it still back to that maturity, right? That maturity of being able to work with that data to actually realize the benefits. So, and also the time it takes for a sector to kind of change its perspective as well around what its role is, because it is moving from a generation focused to a customer focused, and that is happening across the entire sector. And the middleman, to be fair, hasn't seen the generation or the customers before. So it's learning both of those things. So yeah, but fully agree that the whole ideal for this is that we are planning all our future kind of energy infrastructure with the customer, and that the customer has actually basically created a plan for what they're looking for, and then the industry responds. And whatever we can do to get to that, I think is where I'll keep putting my effort. But just also with a lot of knowledge that we are changing a really big system, and it takes lots of little iterations to get to that.
Yeah, and I mean, I agree with you, and I was being a bit too harsh. I think the big EDBs know like we only have a handful of big EDBs that have the depth and breadth to be able to turn their minds to something that is new, uncertain, and complex. And Powerco and Orion and Vector and I mean, they're all doing great work. And we have a lot of little EDBs that are, they're little, they're really interested. The intent is good. And I'm actually one of the outliers. I think the EDB structure is not necessarily, people talk about amalgamation and whether we should all bring. I actually, personally, I don't think it's worth it. You can gain lots of the benefits of coordination without having to necessarily change from the community structure, and trying to unpick that is going to be probably more work than worth. But I do think, and then we're seeing this, I'm seeing this already, the larger EDBs within a wider region like Southland or the Upper North Island, they're working together and sharing lessons through that. And so that's really encouraging. I think it'll be the leaders like Powerco and Vector and Orions and North Powers that will help all of the regional kind of brothers and sisters make the most use of that data.
So I can take one example. So if we use the community energy concept as a starting point, because I think it really helps depict what that kind of future world, or current world now, but ideal world in the future, will really look like, where we are planning with a broad kind of engagement from communities around what they're going to need in the future, and then plan up. If we look at that today with who has access to the smart meter data, each individual part of that value chain is allowed to look at it for their particular purpose, but they're not allowed to put it together to be able to make that full view, to say, okay, this is what is actually happening in the community. These people will benefit, these ones won't under this scenario, but if we change it, these ones will benefit, these ones won't. And this is my, I guess, challenge, that at the moment, distribution can now access it for operational purposes, which is managing the network. But the next piece is really, how can they help community energy projects? Because that's the kinds of requests we're getting. It's like, we're trying to do this with our data, our technology. can you help us plan? At the moment, we have to say, well, we'd love to, but we have to kind of actually ask you for permission to be able to do that. Because at the moment, the responsibility is that we're stuck to a contract with retailers for that purpose, that intended purpose. So how are we going to bridge, how are we going to start breaking that down a bit? I think one of the easiest ways that I see is that we can throw out those kind of survey requests. Can we use your information for this purpose? And then everyone is on board, but that does require someone that can basically do that on your behalf. At the moment, when we do a community energy project, they just don't have the resource to then go out and survey everyone, get that feedback back, and then we go through the checks and balances. So it could take a while before we've got that kind of momentum, I guess, before we can do some more interesting types of analysis with this data.
So I'd just like to interrupt there and sort of open this up to the floor, because I guess from my perspective, smart meter data has a whole bunch of benefits beyond, I guess, just helping the EDBs, in the sense that you can use it for a whole lot of things, especially thinking about what might the future look like, and how does that kind of how can we use this information to think about what the future might look like, and how we can help the energy transition sort of more broadly. And that's a lot of what the researchers in the room think about. So I guess I'd just like to open it up to the floor to kind of for comments on any of this topic, but also if you want to ask the panel their perspectives on anything to do with smart meter data. So.
I'm going to ask a question about MB. If you look on their website, they've got like 12 result areas, and result area 12 was big battery. Result area 1 was having an energy sector strategy, and they hadn't done any work on it. So how do we have an energy transition if we don't have a vision and a strategy? So you get different views across the energy sector. Oh, we hate solar, decentralized generation. Oh, we love it, just leave it to the generators. We seem to be missing a piece, which is what's the vision, what's the strategy? So is that a true statement of what is happening in the energy sector? Or anybody want to comment on MB?
I'll be brave. I'll take this. I can't speak for MB. I would say that the closest, if you want to see what the current government's vision for the energy sector is, I think the best document to look at right now is the GPS of electricity that the Minister of Energy released. So that's a government policy statement of electricity. It was written by him. It is going to be the closest thing right now to the strategy for the energy sector. So take a look at that. There is work underway by industry on creating an energy sector framework. They haven't called it a strategy, but it's an energy sector framework. And they're trying very hard to work with government to make that a joint public-private thing. At the moment, it is a private thing, but it is trying to answer the questions you just asked.
And I'll just reiterate what I said in my talk before. I don't think we've got a joint understanding of what an equitable transition looks and feels like. Like, how do we bring up those in energy hardship and the communities that are utterly disengaged at the moment, other than they want to turn their lights on? I think even in this room, there's a group missing, Māori. We had a pretty significant week this week around that. So what is self-determination, data sovereignty, what does that look like for them? None of us can talk about that. So there's quite a bit of work to be done there. I was talking to Amir from Rokawa the other day, and he was talking about that inland port in Hamilton. It's a microgrid owned by Tainui. It's like, that's interesting. What else are they thinking about doing, or could they be doing in the next 10 years? And I think that would look and feel very different to what something I would come up with, or some of my other members.
Yeah, just going back to data, it seems to me that when you're looking at smart meter data, for those who are third parties, there are kind of two levels at which it's useful. One is at the very kind of disaggregated level, at looking at smart meter data of individual households, and that you might need that if you're doing like an intervention and you want to understand how that particular household has changed its energy use over time. But there's another level at which smart meter data can be incredibly useful at an aggregated level, just looking at broader patterns of electricity consumption over spatial spreads and over time. And in that light, one of the sort of suggestions in this paper that Jonathan led was the potential for a kind of a central data repository that would receive consumption data from all New Zealand smart meter sets and anonymise it, and thus be able to be used by researchers or potential retailers who wanted to enter the market, or others who wanted to develop new market propositions based on a much better understanding of New Zealand's energy demand patterns. And that's quite a different proposition, and maybe quite a different question to think about what if something like that might work for New Zealand, where you would have no way of linking that data back to an individual household, or even a cluster of households. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's kind of, it's on my wish list, I suppose. I think maybe just to pick up on the final sentence there, if you can't link it back to, so you've attempted to anonymize it, okay? That's actually incredibly difficult when you've got very high granular data. And if we have even increased granularity, which would be much more useful, for example, for building research, to enable you to untangle the different loads that are going on in there. Because at the moment with smart meter data at half-hourly level, that's incredibly difficult to do, other than that's a wodge of hot water. Okay, that's about it. You are back in the space where that becomes identifiable again. So I was involved in a project called SEARL, the Smart Energy Research Lab, which was in the UK, which took about 16,000 homes, collected smart meter data with consent through the process that the UK has, which is that it's held in the meters for 13 months. There's no central repository, not in the system at least. And we were pulling that back. And there was the decision was taken to only allow that data to be analysed in a trusted, secure research environment, like the Stats New Zealand IDI, because if otherwise a retailer could take that half-hourly data, they could quite straightforwardly match it to the data they've already got to see if any of their customers were in that sample. And we had other interesting, very interesting and very personal information on those dwellings and people in them. So immediately it's disclosive. So I think we have to think quite carefully about, if we did this, and I think absolutely, yes, we probably should think about doing this, how we can make that work. And that's why your point about aggregation for certain kinds of research purposes and planning purposes, management purposes, operational purposes, I think is key, because at some levels, it doesn't need to be restricted. It can be open. You can put some sort of Creative Commons or whatever licensed usage around it. But at other levels, I think we have to be quite careful about how we enable use. The SEARL project may not have got it entirely right, because when we were doing research, it took a long time to get stuff out because it had to go through a human to check you weren't releasing data, for example, as the Stats IDI does. There's things we could improve, clearly, but absolutely, I think something of that ilk, that nature, it is fundamental to improving accessibility to smart meter data for all kinds of purposes. And I think that all kinds of purposes is important. And that's why I really, Gareth, thank you for putting up the circle diagram with all the blue and the three little gold. Because kind of BRANZ is in the three little gold bits, and we're not in all the other blue bits, really. But there's a lot of people that are in neither the gold or the blue. So smart meter data has all sorts of potentially interesting uses well outside of the energy sector. And that needs to be brought into the tent. And if maybe take a couple of 1 or 2 minutes. For example, I did some early work with some of the UK smart meter data, trying to see if you could do census-like data collection from smart meter data, where certain features of the data are good indicators of certain kinds of households. So you can do area level statistics without touching a house. It kind of can work in some situations. You can think about it in terms of what's a daytime census. So the census is essentially a nighttime census, and you know about travel to work, but you don't know who's where during the day. So smart meter data can give you that. If you need to do disaster planning, for example, who are we going to have to try to reach in what areas because something has happened? And you can also do area level assessment of policy interventions or you know, not just policy, but other kinds of interventions as well, where you don't need access at the household level. So if you're sheep dipping a whole neighborhood to do something, and you've got an equivalent neighborhood over there, you can do reasonably good analysis with aggregated data, which can be open. It's not identifying anybody. So there's value. And the final one, I think, actually is the health sector. There's an extraordinary range of things that you can do with smart meter data as an indicator of things which are indicators of health, whether it's ongoing deterioration of health in certain of somebody living in a home where a change in energy use is indicated that something needs to be done quite quickly, or other kinds of assessments of changes in practices or behaviors which are health related. So I think we need to broaden the tent hugely, and that would then have a much stronger story, I think, about the benefit, the wider benefits, social benefits, system benefits, New Zealand benefits of the kind of infrastructure you're talking about.
And it's kind of interesting because, I mean, there's no way you could think of all those uses beforehand and ask permission.
Well, that's exactly right. And we're kind of into the sort of Lawrence Lessig's information wants to be free, and that's not free in money terms. It's free as in freedom, that you don't know the innovation that can come unless you enable that information to be free for others to innovate with. And I mean freedom, not necessarily free cost.
Okay, so we won't go on too much longer because it's almost afternoon tea time. But just one last question is, I guess, sort of, what do you think is the way forward? And so, I mean, I guess on the whole range of topics that have kind of come up today, you know, what's the way forward for, say, better access to this data? What's the way forward? You know, what's the future for I guess EDBs and being able to use this data for different things? Yeah, so feel free to take the question where you will, but Ben, you can
start. The mic. So just to follow on from where we were, I think that's one of the ways forward. And I do wonder whether the consumer data right might be a mechanism for doing some of this stuff, where an accredited, I think it's an accredited requester, would be a large-scale entity who is able to request that data and receive that data on behalf of third-party researchers and so on, whether that could work. And just flippantly, please, can we have UTC timestamps and not a whole variation of different ways of setting the time?
So I think we've talked about that we need to reframe what this data is and what it kind of means. And I think this is what we're really getting to, that it is a resource that should be owned by the customers and be used for their benefit in way more ways than what we're probably currently thinking about. And so democratizing it in a way that is accessible to everyone outside of the industry, I think, is the right thing to think about. And in a parallel to census is something that I think we can all kind of get our heads around to some degree. And that would be an amazing first step. I really think it really would be. And the same thing, though, can happen with all of the other stuff that these smart meters are capturing. So the network information that we talked about, which isn't necessarily even something that identifies an individual, but it completely tells you what on earth is going on at that part of the network, is also something that should be considered to be democratized, because that's the thing that will drive things like the flexibility market. It shows where the constraints are, the constraints that are going to actually break things, without having to necessarily point to individuals, but at least let the market go, okay, here's the type of opportunity or the kind of problem that the network is trying to resolve, and my solution can potentially do that or it can't. So yeah, and it can then open up a much broader conversation about how communities can actually plan for the future, because they can all access a much deeper understanding of who their community is. So that's a good start for the future.
I don't really have a really good answer. I think it's a great shame that Consumer Advocacy Council was dissolved. I think we probably need that voice in the next steps. In lieu of that, well, okay, no, just re-establish that, give it a different name if we need to do that politically. But yeah, I think that voice, that angle needs to be loud and clear in this discussion. We do have the Energy Wellbeing Evaluation Consortium, but that's voluntary, and we'd need to put some considerable wheels on that to make it useful for this. But yeah, from my angle, from the community angle, I think we just want to have a good relationship with the researchers, and we'll take their leadership on this one.
Okay. It's probably not fair because the Electricity Authority isn't here, so but I'm going to put everything in their camp anyway. This is their regulatory system, so it has to sit with them. And I know they're doing some good work in this space, but they're doing a lot of work in many spaces because there's a lot of asks on them right now, so they're very busy. How I would take this forward is I would get a group of stakeholders together, EDBs, retailers, MEPs, consumer voice, community groups. I would spend half a day or 2 days or a week being really crystal clear on what do we want to do with data and what are the objectives, what are the high level benefits, network optimization, research, planning, et cetera. And then once you're really crystal clear on that, you just look at the current settings, you identify how they're not working or where they're working well, you keep the bits that are working well, and then you amend the code and you do some brave calls and you fix the bits that aren't working. And you run that through a concentrated working group through the EA, and I'm oversimplifying it, but you just bang it out in 6 months, job done. But to Janet's point, it doesn't often work like that in the regulatory and legislative space, and I recognize that. We've been trying to amend our act for at least 10 years, and now have it for this year, and it'll take a good year and a half to go through, and that's good, things take time. Yeah.
But so thank you very much. I think this has been okay, we're going to have one more from Phoebe because she uses that.
Thanks. Really interesting conversation. I'd just like to throw in there that one more group that I think needs to be included there are renewable energy providers. I'm really interested in finding out how they develop recommendations for their clients. Yeah, so I think they need to be in that camp as well.
Thank you. Okay, so let's break for afternoon tea, and we're back here at 4 p.m. But before we do that, could we thank our panelists for providing us their insights?